Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this presentation. In this essay, I'd like to talk about US presidential elections. So focusing just on those from the time of Harry Truman. So it's the first post-World War II presidential election in 1948, and coming right through to the present day. Now I'll do some conclusions at the end and some discussion on some of the facts. I'll say now though, before I get to the end, that the only election that comes out as a particular anomaly in a number of ways is the 2020 presidential election. It's not typical, it breaks with trends, it breaks with all sorts of statistical trend analysis, and so stands out very particularly amongst all the presidential elections as being very unusual. So I'll come back to that at the end, but let's go through starting in 1948, and I've had to make some notes because there's so many numbers and facts and figures to go through here. But this 1948 election is, of course, Harry Truman, and he's up against Dewey, and this is the first post-World War II election. Now, Truman has become president on the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Truman, of course, being the vice president, and he's thrust into the president's position just as World War II is kind of coming to a close. It's Truman's decision, or it's thrust onto his desk to decide whether or not to use the atomic bomb and so on. Truman wasn't really kept in the loop much by Roosevelt and his cronies. So Truman actually did a fairly decent job in the overall scheme of things of having to take on this responsibility with not really having been in the front line of the decision-making loop. So now Truman wins the 1948 election. Now this is just the beginning, the very early stages of what was to become the full-blown Cold War. So the Soviet Union, the communist Russia as it was called, the Soviet Union, was now the second most powerful nation on earth, had a huge military, and the only counterweight to communist power was the United States. So Truman's now the leader of the free world. To give you some sort of perspective, given a lot of the world had been destroyed or certainly grievously damaged by World War II, of the total world economy, the United States had nearly 50% of the world economy, just the United States alone. That gives you some idea of the extent to which the war had caused wealth to concentrate, as the United States hadn't been invaded, and in fact had invested a lot in huge production capability in the day, advanced machinery and production techniques and so on. So 50% of world wealth in the US after the end of World War II. Now Truman won the 1948 election by a 2 million vote margin. He carries 29 states. There was an independent candidate that got just shy of 1 million votes. Overall, there was a 52% voter turnout. Now, just keep your eye on that voter turnout numbers, because again, the voter turnout for the 2020 presidential election, where Biden supposedly got 81 million votes, that was the highest voter turnout in the history of United States presidential voting, or certainly in modern history anyway, and depending on how you count the number of eligible voters, I guess. But so only 52% voter turnout. Now, this was a time when there was a lot of political discussion. There was, the concern over Cold War and things like that, the rebuilding after World War II. But there was also a lot of wealth in the United States. The purchasing power of the American worker's paycheck was very high, and people who would have been hitherto considered working class could buy a house in the suburbs and have a car and start, acquiring consumer goods like refrigerators, this sort of thing. So it was a new era, and the American citizen was by far and away the wealthiest in the world. And so the participation in voting, even in a presidential election, probably wasn't as intense as maybe it would be in other times when there was heavily politicized activity. Truman was an interesting sort of president, because he was really a guy from sort of outside the Beltway, and he came from Missouri. He'd been a haberdasher at one point, but he was active in administration in varying ways. But he had sort of a hometown folksy way of looking at things, and he had some famous lines, like he only wanted to do business with a one-handed economist, because every time he spoke to a supposed economics expert, they'd say, well, this and this and this, but on the other hand. So he had this joke about he only wanted to have a one-handed economist, and had a number of other type homespun type ways of explaining things. There's also an interesting one where Dewey, in terms of the East Coast vote, Dewey looked like he was going to win, and some newspapers declared in the presidential election they thought they'd get out ahead of the curve, so they produced newspapers that Dewey had won. And in fact, Truman came home with the Midwest and the Western vote with again a 2 million vote margin and carried 29 states. Now, in 1952, the Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the well-known big brand name general from World War II, and was credited as defeating the Nazis in Europe and so on. Now he was up against the Democrat Adlai Stevenson, and Eisenhower, again big brand name and considered to be a true patriot. Now by 1952, America was embroiled in war in Korea, and already the Cold War was reaching a sort of a fever pitch, where there was a lot of concern around that the communists were taking over, or intended to, and were in the throes of taking over the world, and the communists were going to come and they were the boogeyman under the bed or in the closet at the time, and so America was looking towards a powerful. Here's a general. He beat the Nazis. God damn it! Those commies fucking get out of line. He'll kick the and so on. So very much a rallying around Eisenhower, and Adlai Stevenson, the Democrat candidate, was considered to be a bit soft on communism, probably unfairly so, that characterisation, by the way. But Eisenhower won by 6.5 million votes, big margin back in the day. He carried 40 states, and given the Korean War and the heightened hand-wringing about communism, there was a 62% turnout for, in terms of voter turnout of eligible voters or registered voters, I think it was. So Eisenhower winning by a big margin there, which was reflected in the Cold War concerns. Eisenhower backed up in 1956, where he won by even more, by 9 million votes, and he carried 41 states. Bear in mind the total amount of votes here. In 1956, 62 million people voted. So now that's Eisenhower's 2 terms there. In 1960, John Kennedy was the Democrat, was up against Nixon. Kennedy won by a very narrow margin, just over 100,000 votes. He only won 24 of the 50 states, and it was quite a high voter turnout, again reflecting the anxiety over the Cold War. 63% voter turnout there, and there's a bit of confusion over the numbers. Bear in mind that people under the age of 21 couldn't vote at this stage, so something to keep in mind as you look at the numbers here. So this is people 21 and over voting. Now, Kennedy, as we know, was assassinated in November 1963 in Texas. I actually paced out that area where he was assassinated, went there and wore out the shoe leather and paced it all out. Still an eerie feeling, being in that place where that happened. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, who assumed the presidency on Kennedy's death, stood for election, and he was up against the Republican Barry Goldwater. I know Goldwater was I thought a weak candidate. I'm surprised they put him up. I wouldn't have thought he had much chance of winning. Johnson won by a landslide, considering the day, 16 million votes, and he carried 44 states. So a landslide victory for Johnson. Now Johnson seemed like he was going to contest the 1968 election. He took everyone by surprise, saying that he wouldn't contest another election. Or not seek another term as your president, I think was his words. Robert Kennedy, who'd been John Kennedy's Attorney General, was going to make a run for the presidency. He also was assassinated in 68, as indeed Martin Luther King was. So in 1968, Richard Nixon, the Republicans, up against Hubert Humphrey. George Wallace, the Southern governor, ran as an independent and got nearly 10 million votes in that election. So carried 5 states as well, interestingly. Now, Richard Nixon carried 32 states, but he only won the popular vote by about 500,000. Voter turnout again was in the low 60s, 73 million votes total cast. Nixon, quite a narrow win. I think Nixon would have got quite a bit more. I think George Wallace got 10 million votes. I think a lot of those votes would have probably gone to Nixon. But nonetheless, Nixon wins. Now, in 1972, this is when the 18-year-olds are starting to vote, or people under the age of 21, so 18 to 21. The idea is that if you're 18 and you can be called up under the draft for military service, then you should have the right to vote. I agree with that. There was quite a bit of debate about it at the time that 18-year-olds were too young. And then I think if they'd said, well, look, if you get called up for the draft, then you automatically get the vote, that I would have seen. Or those who might be eligible for the draft get the vote. And, so I'm not sure how to slice and dice that and make it fair and reasonable and legal and so on. But anyway, everyone under the age of 21 got the vote, women too, and women weren't going to be called up for military service. So Richard Nixon was, the Republican incumbent, was up against the Democrat challenger, George McGovern. Nixon won by a landslide here. It's one of the biggest landslides ever. He won by 18 million votes. There was only 76 million votes cast, and quite a low voter turnout, which was odd. So there's a whole lot of new voters coming into the system here, and but only a 56% voter turnout. There's only slightly more votes cast in 1972 than there were in 1968. This is with all the baby boomers coming through into the voting. Nixon carried 49 states for goodness sake. So a landslide victory for Nixon with a reduced voter turnout. But just there were 62% voter turnout in 1968, 56 in 1972. This is interesting given the hysteria around the Vietnam War, the draft, and all that. The nuclear proliferation treaties and all sorts of stuff, like the hippies and so on. Now, Nixon resigned the presidency given the Watergate scandal. There's a lot of information coming out recently that the CIA and the FBI colluded to do a hatchet job on Nixon because he wasn't a good globalist flunky. Now, I'll stop you just talking about the globalist thing for a minute. If we look at the policy positions of the presidential candidates, the Democrat and the Republican, they were both obviously very committed to improving the lives of Americans, also committed to stopping communism, things like that. And they had a role, being the biggest military in the world. But the policy positions reflected different ideologies, and for example, a more capitalist-leaning ideology for the Republicans and a more socialist-leaning ideology from the Democrats. A lot of social programs from the Democrats, public ownership of common assets such as electricity generation, water distribution, and energy generally, these sorts of things. And so there was quite clear policy differences. Now, as you look through the rhetoric and the policy positions through these elections, you see that the policy positions are gradually coming closer and closer together, and they'll soon become indistinguishable. And so you keep an eye on that, or keep that in the back of your mind as we're going forward here. Now, Nixon resigned supposedly under the scandal of Watergate, again, it's quite a nuanced situation there. Did Nixon? Was it a setup? Was Nixon sort of up to no good? And there was a cabal around Nixon, Ehrlichman and Haldeman and these sort of things that suggested that there was a cabal running the place. We just had a bad look about it. Anyway, Gerald Ford, who was Nixon's vice president, assumed the presidency on Nixon's resignation, and he was up against the Democrat challenger Jimmy Carter, who was, I think he's from Georgia. I think he was a farmer, or had been the governor, I think, too, of the state. Now, this is 1976. Now, Carter won, I think it's one of the quite a narrow margin, really, a lot of ways. He only won 23 of the 50 states, and you wouldn't think it'd be possible to win the election, but it was. So 1.7 million vote margin to Carter, so that was decent enough. Quite a low turnout. It was even a lower turnout than the 1972 election, and one of the in terms of that era, one of the lower voter turnouts, just shy of 80 million votes. So again, in that 4 years, and the baby boomers are pouring into the workforce and the colleges and so on. That 4 years between 72 and 1976, there was about 3.5 million extra votes were cast of the total number of eligible voters. Now, Jimmy Carter was an unpopular president, and was really he was up against the rising oil prices, international inflation issues and low growth, stagnation and high inflation, which was billed as stagflation back in the day. And Carter also had where the Iranians held American hostages in the embassy in Tehran, and Carter appeared weak and indecisive and looked like he was being slapped around by the Ayatollahs, and that went down like a lead balloon with the public. And Ronald Reagan, the Republican candidate, who interestingly came from California. Can you imagine a Republican coming out of California today? So 1980 this is. Reagan was very clear he wasn't going to put up with any nonsense from Iran. And so on the day Reagan was elected, the Iranians, rather wisely I thought, decided to let all the hostages, the American embassy go. So now Reagan won decisively in this election, just a one-term president, Jimmy Carter, and it was an 8.5 million vote margin, and Ronald Reagan carried 44 states. There was an independent that got in ballpark 6 million votes. They probably would have gone to Reagan. There was 84 million votes cast. So again, 3.5 to 4 million new voters coming into the voting here. Now, in 1984, so this is Ronald Reagan's second term. He's up against, I thought, a rather weak candidate, a former vice president, but Walter Mondale. And Mondale wasn't a bad speaker, actually, if you sort of look at his, how he'd speak publicly. I thought he was quite okay, but I think he's from Minnesota. He had a female running mate, Geraldine Ferraro, as his vice presidential running mate, and that didn't seem to work very well. His nickname, Walter Mondale's nickname, was Fritz, and so there was the thing was going around, the sort of joke was going around at the time, and Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro were referred to as Fritz and Tits, which was kind of funny in its way, I suppose, although rather vulgar humour. Reagan wins by an absolute landslide, so 17 million votes margin, and again just a runaway landslide. Now there was a higher vote participation here, so there was around 7 million more votes cast this time than it was in 1980. So a good result there for Reagan. So that's Reagan's two terms. In 1988, George Bush Senior, this is not to be confused with W. He had been vice president in Reagan's administration. He was running for the presidency, and the Democrat candidate was a guy called Mike Dukakis. And George Bush Senior was not an impressive candidate for president, far from it. And I was surprised that the Democrats picked even someone less impressive than George Bush Senior. I mean, he was going around because he had some Greek background. His folks or his grandparents are Greek immigrants, so he was going around to these Greek places doing Greek dancing and so on. I thought, what are you doing? And I thought he was unimpressive there. But Bush wins quite a decent margin, 7 million votes. He carries 40 states. This was interestingly the last time, 1988, that California voted Republican in a presidential election. That was the last time it happened. It never happened again or since. And I doubt it will unless there's mass deportations. So 1992. George Bush Senior's up against the Democrat candidate Bill Clinton from Arkansas, the governor of Arkansas. 58% voter turnout here. It's not huge. It's in the upper range. Most of the voter turnouts, by the way, between say 52 and 58, 59% of voters voting. That seems to be the, if you like, the trending range. There are a couple of aberrations outside of that, but not many. Ross Perot was running, the billionaire businessman Ross Perot was running as an independent candidate. He got nearly 20 million votes, by the way, so he did all right. Clinton wins, though, with a 5 million vote majority, and again, he carries, I think it was 40 states here. 1996, it was Bill Clinton was up against Bob Dole, the Republican candidate. Dole was I thought, a very weak candidate. I thought he didn't have a snowball's chance of winning. If you look at Dole, against the relative sort of charismatic elements of Clinton, then Dole didn't have a snowball's chance. I'm intrigued that he could have been put up as a candidate. Clinton wins with an increased majority, which is unsurprising given, again, the unimpressive candidate there. It's almost like they thought, the Republicans thought, we can't win, so we'll just put someone in there who can be easily burned. We don't care if they get burned, rather than put a promising presidential candidate later on and get them to be burned early. So it's 8 million votes that Clinton won by, carries 31 states. Ross Perot ran again, the businessman, this time getting about 8 million votes compared to his like nearly 10 million before, or 20 million votes before rather. Now, one of the interesting things in here was Perot was not allowed to enter any of the presidential debates. This was, I think, the first sort of real sign the deep state was running things. Now, it was there as a sort of under the surface, but this was one of the real sort of first times that's the deep state taking control there. Now, by this stage, even sort of in not necessarily the first term of Reagan, but certainly by the second term, the difference between Republican and Democrat is blurred to be almost non-existent. Some may favour, two lesbian marches a year, and the other may favour one. But the difference between them in economics and social organisation, all these sorts of things, the difference is now about zero, or getting close to it. Now, there can be some. For example, Reagan made a big thing about cutting taxes to get the economy moving, which did work to some extent, but increased the debt out of sight. So he had this view. Reagan had this view that he could also reduce expenditures, even though he was cutting taxes to gin up the economy. He had this idea he could cut expenses to the bone, but in fact that never happened. He was stymied by Congress. Nobody wanted to defund their little treasured social programs. So he never was able to get that. So by the time, though, it's George Bush Sr. and Mike Dukakis, it's obvious that the globalists are now fully in control. And if we look at, say, Reagan, his policies to do with giving amnesty to illegal aliens and things like that. Now, sure, he wanted to break the power of the communists, but only insofar as it was a threat to the globalist order rather than communism itself. So I see Reagan as one of the early globalists, and whether it was inadvertent or he intended it or not, his policies, for example, the giving amnesty to illegals from South America, his full support for divorce laws, things like that, indicated that he was a real front runner of that globalisation sort of factor. Now, so Clinton wins 1996 quite handsomely, 8 million vote margin, carries 31 states, and in 2000 it's Bush versus Gore. So now Al Gore is Clinton's vice president, again a through and through globalist flunky, as is Bush. Now Bush maybe had some idea that he was going to act independently outside of the globalist sort of permission and allowance scheme, but he was disavowed of that pretty quickly once he got into office. But Bush, in the 2000 Bush-Gore election, Gore was quite a good public speaker, I thought, but more impressive than Bush. And Bush was portrayed as this drooling idiot, and Gore as this highly educated fucking genius, which is of course nonsense. But Bush did a good job. I saw a few interviews where Bush was sort of caught off camera, and he was sharp if not brutish. But when he was out sort of doing his public thing, he seemed to put on this homespun idiot type approach, which seemed to work. Anyway, Bush carried 30 states. He only won by 5 electoral college votes, but he lost the popular vote by 500,000. So a very narrow victory. You may remember it was a hotly contested election, went through the courts on some things, such as the Florida in particular, where they used a voting ballot form where you had to punch out little holes in it, and were these holes properly punched out? There was a lot of toing and froing there. In the event, Florida finally went with Bush, which gave him the win. So it was a very close run thing, and again, hotly contested through the courts and so on. Now, of course, in 2000, there's not only the dot-com bust, but there's also heavy reduction in interest rates to artificially ridiculous low levels, but and also the war on terror and the Patriot Act and all sorts of things like that. And so in 2004, Bush is up against, I thought, a very unimpressive John Kerry, a leftist darling in many ways, pushing pushing insane ideas on climate change. But Bush wins 31 states. I thought Kerry was an unimpressive candidate. Bush wins by 31 states and 3 million votes. But again, both candidates are super pro-globalist. So now in 2008, that's Bush's two terms there, George W. Bush. In 2008, Obama, the first black candidate, and again a globalist sort of contrived piece of whether they're putting Obama in there or putting Kamala in there, it doesn't matter if they're non-white, it needs to be contrived. But Obama's up against John McCain. Now John McCain has got to be one of the least impressive candidates that you could imagine, and in my view, Obama, whatever you might think about Obama, and I don't think much of him as a president, but he was a very good public speaker, and he didn't say anything. He said, we got to do change. Yeah, let's do change, and everybody applauds madly. Well, what change? What are you going to change? And that wasn't covered. He just came out with some nice one-liners, but he was a good speaker, and he tirelessly campaigned. He campaigned his ass off, so he worked very hard. He won, unsurprisingly, by 9.5 million votes, but he only carried 28 states. The voter turnout was high. A lot of college kids came out for Obama, and he's black, and they went into swoon over that. So 62% turnout, very high in trend line terms, and now this is an interesting election too. Obama got the all-time record for presidential elections. Obama got the record with 129 million votes rather were cast, and Obama got 69 million of those. So winning handsomely and decisively in that very heavy one-sided voting in California. But both of these two, Obama and McCain, are globalist flunky stooges. So, but now Obama, at this point, 2008 here, presidential election, Obama holds the all-time record for the number of votes cast for a candidate, 69. I mean, it is the record by quite a decent margin, by the way. So even some of the landslide victories of the Nixons and all that sort of thing earlier on, nothing matches this 69 million votes that Obama got. And again, a higher voter turnout due to the college kids coming out in force. Now in 2012, Obama, again, the globalist candidate, is up against the Republican candidate, the super globalist, Mitt Romney. I mean, two super globalist candidates here. You struggle to see what difference they have. And coming back to the 2008 one quickly, Obama was talking about that he wouldn't allow American jobs to be sent overseas, and he was going to defend American jobs. And then it was discovered that he was privately giving briefings to business saying, don't worry, I'm just saying that to win the election. Sure, we'll be sending lots of jobs overseas. Don't worry about it, and everything will be okay. Which was the globalist position of transferring jobs from America to the third world. So huge deceit by Obama there. 2012, Obama's up against Mitt Romney, again, both globalist candidates. Romney did this thing where he was this sort of wide-eyed college kid look that he put on. I'm not threatening it. he's like a fucking merchant banker or something. So Obama wins by 5 million votes, carries 26 states, so it's no crushing victory, but decent enough, decisive enough. Now Obama's vote drops by 4 million from his first election win, and the turnout's quite well down. So fewer people voted in 2012, even though there was extra voters that come in. Fewer people voted in 2012 than voted in 2008, even though there was 3-4 million plus additional voters that appeared on the rolls. There was several million fewer votes cast from the eligible voters. Nonetheless, Obama wins, but 3.89 million votes fewer than he got in his first election win. So 2016, so we're now to Trump against Hillary Clinton. Now Clinton was the establishment candidate and Trump was the outsider candidate. And I remember this well, that the media was just 150% on Hillary's side, and were denouncing and sneering and condescending at Trump and all his people at every turn. And even news outlets that you thought would have been reasonably sort of neutral and middle of the road, they excuse me, they came out heavily against Trump. And I saw people getting interviewed from Trump's team, and it wasn't an interview, it was just an all-out assault on these people. And they tried to come to these interviews in good faith and treat the questions as good faith questions, but none of them were. They were all just attempts to smear and sneer at Trump and his team. It was an outrageous piece of one-sided media coverage. Much to the surprise of everybody, myself included, by the way. Trump got up and he carried 30 states. Hillary got the popular vote by, I think, 2.85 million advantage. Again, there were only a handful of votes more in 2016 were cast than were cast when Obama won his first term. So it's about 129 million votes, give or take a handful, between 2016 2008. So in spite of all the new voters coming in on the voting, or eligible voters, but also the new registered voters, now it was a decent turnout in the overall scheme of things, but now there were 215 million total potential voters, and 129, if I've got my sums right here, 129 million voters turned out to vote. So Trump won the Electoral College quite decisively, and again took a lot of people, myself included, by surprise. I was doing some work at the time, and I just had I think it was Fox News or one of the channels on in background, and I just expected Hillary to win, given how heavily the media was supporting her and the establishment was supporting her, and her quite casual attitude that anyone that didn't vote for her was a deplorable. I mean, for goodness me, is that a way to win friends and influence people? And so then you could tell the shock on the news announcers' sort of voice when they started countenancing the idea that Trump was in with a real show to win. And so, and at that point I looked around and saw the vote tallies of which states Trump had won and the Electoral College, and thought, goodness me, he's going to win. And then there it was. Trump was the next president of the United States, and I hadn't expected an outsider to win. And I thought that was quite an exciting night, that a non-globalist candidate had actually won the presidency. So I thought that the world still has a chance to pull back from the brink. But anyway, so 2020. Now here's the thing. The 2020 election, where more than half the votes cast were by mail-in ballot. Now the administration of the mail-in ballots, in terms of signature matching, in terms of cleaning up the electoral rolls to make sure that the people who were getting ballots were really registered voters, and that the voting rolls were up to date and this sort of thing. None of the administration necessary to clean up the voter rolls was done in 2020. So you had some very, very old and out of date and just inaccurate voter rolls, and so ballots were being sent out en masse to people that didn't exist, had died 10 years ago and moved interstate and so on and so forth. So we're looking at a very unusual election in terms of somewhere, depending on whose numbers you look at actually, but between sort of 35 and 40% of voters, or 35 and 45% of voters voted in person, and the rest voted by a postal ballot. Now everyone can see the postal ballot is wide open for fraudulent activity, and where voting integrity can be easily and effortlessly compromised, and many argue that it was in this instance. Nonetheless, it was the highest voter turnout ever in overall vote. It was the highest voter turnout ever in the history of the United States. 66% of eligible voters voted. Now that had never happened before. That is the highest by far. That's unusual. Why in that election? Now you can say, well, if people had the option of just sitting around their kitchen table and filling out the votes, and they didn't have to bother with going to the voting booth. So I'm not sure I buy that, but anyway. So now the other thing was the amount of votes cast. There were over 155 million votes. 155 million votes cast. So that's 26.5 million more votes were cast in 2020 than were cast in 2016. Now, if you look at the average difference in trendline terms, difference between each 4 years, there's give or take 3 million votes, and there's usually a big issue that brings a lot of people out to vote. For example, an independent candidate running that might attract voters that otherwise wouldn't have voted, that sort of thing. So there's usually 3 to 4 million as a trend issue. But in this instance, between 2016 and 2020, there were 26.5 million more votes cast than in the previous election. Now, that's ahistorical in the extreme. That's never happened before. And it seems that of those 26 million more voters and votes, that nearly all of them voted for Biden. Now, there's a couple of other things that are interesting. this is the first time that a losing candidate, Trump in this case, that's assuming we accept the election as it was, but there's Trump actually got nearly 10 million more votes, approximately 10 million more votes, slightly more than that actually, 10 million more votes in 2020 than in 2016. This is the first time in certainly as I can perceive it anyway, first time in history that a losing candidate got more votes than they did the last time. So Trump gets 63 odd million in 2016 and gets on or about 74 million in 2020. So 10 million plus more votes than he did in the previous election, but is the losing candidate. That's never happened in certainly that I can find, correct me if I'm wrong, that's never happened in US presidential election history. Sure, there are candidates got a few more votes, they got a handful, a few thousand more votes than they did the previous one and lost, but nothing like on this scale. Now the total number of voters that were eligible only went up by about 19 million during that time, which again is quite a high number. And I'd question that to say, well, how many double counts are there, like a voter, say, going from one state to another, but where they're then registered in both states, so it's like a double count. So there's that. There's the 26 million more votes cast. But if we look at the amount of the natural number of the increased number, if you like, of voters that turned up in the voting pool, such as people turning 18, that type of thing, then there's an anomaly there as well. That doesn't seem to add up, and it seems an unusual number of people registered to vote that hadn't registered previously, and of those people, they nearly all voted for Biden. Now, if you look at other factors here, such as the broken chain of custody on votes, and you look also at the postal ballots where there was no signature matching and so on, then you look at that 2020 presidential election, and it was ahistorical in so many ways, unusual. It stands out clearly, like a sore thumb, for goodness sakes. And the first one is the highest vote turnout ever, the highest number of votes for a presidential candidate, Biden, ever, and by a long shot. Remember, Obama's got the previous record at 69 million. Biden gets 81 million votes. 81 million votes for a candidate that didn't campaign, that is an unimpressive speaker. No matter how you look at it, he's very unimpressive. I mean, he's the John McCain of the Democrat Party. So he should have got somewhere between 55 and 60 million votes if you look at it on a trend basis. But somehow he got the vote record in all of history, presidential history. So that's the summary there. But when we look at the presidential elections since 1948, even if you go back earlier than that, they stay quite tightly within trend. Again, when you look at the outside of the trend, there's usually an event, such as an independent candidate, like Ross Perot as an example, or George Wallace, that gets a lot of votes and brings voters in that otherwise wouldn't have. But when you take that out and you smooth it out to keep it in trend, then the 2020 presidential election is the only election that is outside of trend, and that alone should cause questions to be asked. You've been with Tacitus today at Your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.